Chapter 11. The buildings alongside the river were neglected, damaged by the elements where vandals or fire had not got to them first. Barbara looked out for signposts, for any kind of clue that might tell her where they were or how far they had come. It felt like they'd been walking for hours. Sometimes their Thameside path was just the pavement running next to the road. Other times it wove around and between buildings, negotiating those structures that fronted onto the river, while keeping their journey as close to the water as possible. The grey day was probably the best thing for walking, the air cool and refreshing. Surely they would hit Wapping any moment, she thought. That seemed so strange. Barbara knew Wapping. She didn't know it well, but she had been there several times. It was not that far from Shoreditch. It was not that far from home. She walked at the back of the group, beside Griffiths. The doctor and Susan were next, Susan huddling close to her grandfather. The attack the girl had suffered the previous day had changed her. She was timid now, never out of arm's reach of the old man. It was a blessing in some ways, Barbara thought. It would have been a nightmare to make the same journey with Susan always running ahead. The group was led by Ian and Bamford. They both moved like soldiers, ever alert and setting the fast, no-nonsense pace. Neither of them spoke. Instead, they watched all round for danger. A group of 4 men and women walked towards them down the path, but Ian and Bamford had already learned how to deal with strangers. They squared their shoulders, walking tall, but keeping to the left, a respectful distance from the others. The strangers were wary, sinking back to their own side of the path. It was like watching rival packs of animals in the wild, thought Barbara, prowling around one another. There was a ritual to how the gang sized each other up. They avoided engagement as long as it didn't mean a loss of honour. It was a tricky business. The strangers passed by. Griffiths watched them until they had moved on out of sight. That they had so far passed without incident did not seem to make Ian or Bamford any happier. The longer they waited for someone to ambush them, the more edgy they became. Their state of mind was contagious too. Barbara could feel the muscles clenching in her neck and shoulders. She was also concerned about the doctor. Whenever she dared to ask him how he was doing, he waved her off crossly, insisting he was perfectly all right. Yet she could see he was exhausted, as much by the speed at which they were herded onwards as by the distance. They couldn't yet be halfway to Whitehall, she thought. The doctor would need to rest. Maybe we should stop somewhere for lunch, she suggested to Griffiths. He answered without looking at her, keeping his eyes peeled. He had volunteered to take guard duty at the back of the group, but Barbara wondered if he just preferred to have everyone ahead of him where he could see them. Yes, he said, his gaze now on the doctor. We could all do with putting our feet up. He took a sudden deep breath. Ian! Ian froze at the sound of his own name, a bullet of noise in the quiet. He and Bamford turned quickly, ready to see off whatever threat Griffiths faced. They looked disappointed that he only wanted their attention. What is it? Barbara saw how Ian regarded Griffiths, still suspicious of the man. Unless it was envy on his part. She had walked beside Griffiths all this time. No, surely Ian couldn't be jealous. Getting peckish, said Griffiths. You're the expert on local watering holes. Ian considered for a moment. I don't really know, he said. But there must be something. We could try Wapping High Street. It's only a little out of our way. There might be something. It won't hurt to try. And they do good food in Wapping, do they? Asked the doctor, suddenly showing an interest. He had looked dead on his feet just a moment ago. Barbara felt herself smile. He could be such a selfish old rogue. I hope so, said Ian. Anything other than gruel. That's if anything's open, warned Barbara. It has to be open, said the doctor, dragging Susan after him as he pushed rudely past Ian and Bamford. However could it not be? The Charles III was a traditional sort of pub, full of people reading newspapers or bickering with their neighbours about what the papers said. On first impression, it reminded Ian of the pubs just north of Oxford Street, where the writers and BBC lot would get drunk. Conversations were male-dominated and over-earnest, with the consonants filed off by the deep-ingrained booze. He spied headlines that gave some clue to the world they'd arrived in. "Bring back our policeman. Guys will reopen. A letter from Manchester." Despite the hubbub, however, Ian found the place lacking in atmosphere. As the doctor and Susan took seats in an empty snug, he realised what it missed. Though the tables and enclaves were mostly all occupied, no one was smoking. Ian was used to supping a pint amid a fog of cigarettes and cigars. A pub where you could breathe easily, where you could see across the room, just seemed wrong somehow. The place didn't have that homely stink that smoking would lend it. In its place, there was just the reek of stale beer. "I'm going to have a pint," he said, trying to raise his own spirits as much as everyone else's. Griffiths, Bamford and Barbara were all watching the other drinkers. Ordering drinks, Ian thought, would make their group less incongruous. "What will it be, Susan? Doctor?" "A glass of water will suit me just fine," said the doctor, wheezing. The war had taken a lot out of the old boy. "And we should all stay alert, don't you think?" "Yes, doctor," Ian demurred. Of course, they had to keep their wits about them. And yet it had been such a long time since Ian had had the simple pleasure of a good British pint. His shoulders sagged as the others all asked for glasses of water too. He couldn't be the only one letting down his guard. "I guess I'm getting these anyway," Bamford said to him. "I'm the girl with the spending money." "See what food they do," Griffiths told her. "Say please." "Please. And get a move on, I'm starving." Laughing, Ian followed Bamford up to the bar. The barman was a tall, round fellow who might have managed the place for centuries. Vast Victorian-style sideburns hid a ruddy complexion. "What'll it be?" he said, addressing the question to Ian. "6 glasses of water," replied Bamford curtly. The barman rolled his eyes. "Go careful," he said, reaching up to the shelf above the bar. "And what food can you do us?" "Specials board on the wall," said the man. Ian looked, but could see no board. He looked back at the barman, who was chuckling to himself as he filled each glass from a groaning, protesting tap. "No specials today?" asked Ian. "Not now I think about it," said the man, deadpan. "You know how things are." He slid 6 glasses of slightly murky water towards them. "But I'm sure I can magic you up something sort of edible. Depends what you got in the way of payment." Bamford withdrew the fat paper envelope from inside her uniform. Like Andrews, she had a range of notes to choose from. The barman lunged forward, curling his fat fingers over the money. For a moment, Ian thought he was trying to rob them. "Keep that out of sight," the man said, trying to lower his voice. But it was too late. Behind them came the scrape of chairs. Ian turned to see a group of swarthy-looking locals heading their way. The doctor was telling Susan a story about the notorious Captain Kidd, who had ended his days not far from where they sat. Barbara found herself laughing along as the doctor extemporized. But whatever droll punchline he had been working towards was cut short. Griffiths had stood up suddenly. "Stay here," he told Barbara. "Get them out if you need to." She nodded and looked back to the main door of the pub. Yes, she was sure their escape would be easy. Only then did she look round at what had alarmed him. At the bar, Ian and Bamford had attracted the rabble. "Got money to burn, then?" leered a man, a full head shorter than Bamford, and missing most of his teeth. Ian saw how the man kept one arm behind his back, as if reaching for a knife. "Can I buy you gentlemen a drink?" Bamford asked. "Gonna buy us all a drink, is she?" came the heckle from another table. We don't want any trouble, said Ian. Don't ya? The toothless man leaned right into Ian's face. His halitosis could have stripped wallpaper. No, he doesn't, said Griffiths, right behind the leering man. And neither do you. Ian saw the leering man consider his options, weighing up the odds against the unseen newcomer. Then the man spun round, thrusting a dagger at Griffiths. Griffiths had the longer reach and smacked his fist into the leering man's face a whole second before the dagger could have reached him. The man swung back, and Ian grabbed the hand holding the knife. Twisting, the leering man tried to fight back. Griffiths fired off rabbit punches into the man's chest, then withdrew as the man vomited up his beer. Ian let the man go. More locals were out of their seats and hurrying to join in the fight. Bamford dodged to the left, ducking round the first punch thrown her way. The man didn't get a second chance to hit her. She raised her knee sharply, doubling him over. Kneeing him again broke his nose. It made a satisfying crunch. As the man dropped to the floor, Bamford lashed out at another of the locals. Another man got a punch into Griffiths' side before Griffiths floored him with a single curt blow. More locals were getting up from their seats. They had to finish this quickly. He turned to Bamford. A man had his hands round her neck while another clawed the envelope from her fingers. Barbara watched, horrified, as Ian hurled himself at one of the gang of rogues, smashing them both into the bar and shattering the glasses of water. She could see the look in his eyes, the fury and determination. He fought well as Griffiths and Bamford did. Like them, he had had training in the martial arts. She remembered him freeing them from the cell in Bing Street and the poor kid he had knocked unconscious. It made her blood run cold to think of it. Her whole body tingling as the breath was squeezed from her, Bamford had nowhere to turn. She wriggled and fought, but the men were too strong. Kicking out, she hit one in the shin, but to no avail. Her eyes watered, and she felt her senses swim. She gave the envelope up to concentrate on her strangler. He had a ratty little beard and a crooked nose. She thrust her fingers into his face, jabbing nails into his eyes. He screamed, but still he held his fingers tightly round her neck. The fight was draining out of her, and there was nothing she could do. Ian fell out of the way of a chair being thrown and leapt up to punch the man who had thrown it. "Gentlemen," called the landlord behind him. "Gentlemen!" Someone's foot smacked into Ian's leg, behind the knee. His whole body flared with pain. He toppled forward, arms flailing, and someone's elbow cracked into his head. Seeing nothing but bright lights, Ian crashed into the floor. Prone, unable to get up again, he watched Bamford collapse backward as someone throttled her. Griffiths tried to get to her. Fighting off 3 men at once, he struggled to reach Bamford and the man standing over her. He knew he'd never make it. They were finished. "Here, lads," said a small Cockney voice. Griffiths punched one man, leaving the impression of his knuckles in the skin. He jabbed his arm back again, catching another of the locals in the neck. "Here, lads," said the voice again, louder this time. "This ain't any kind of money, I know." The fighting just stopped. Griffiths turned, as did his attackers, to the skinny man rifling through the envelope. The thief pulled one note free from the bundle and held it aloft for them all to see. "Who's this King William, then?" he said. "You can't spend that round here." Laughing, he stuffed the note back into the envelope and threw it under arm to Bamford. She caught it, checked it, and, amazed, offered it to the man who had been strangling her. He didn't even bother to look through the notes. Instead, he helped his comrades to their feet, and they all staggered back to their tables. It was like the fight had never happened. Griffiths squatted down beside Ian on the floor. "You all right?" "Fine," said Ian dazedly. "Don't we get an apology?" Barbara came running over. Ian lifted his head, and she hugged him. Griffiths got out of their way. The doctor and Susan were seeing to Bamford. She had terrible dark marks around her neck, but she seemed otherwise to be in one piece. Griffiths made his way over to the bar. The landlord stood behind it, his arms folded. "You've nothing worth stealing," he said simply. "How are you going to pay for the food?" "We thought," began Griffiths. There was no answer he could give. "I'm sorry." "Humph," said the landlord. "You're heading into the city, I take it?" "Yes." Griffiths only felt angry with himself. He should have known better than to bring them here. Londoners never took to strangers. The corner of the man's mouth twitched. "Well, if you promise you'll never come back again, you can have something to eat on your way." By late afternoon they had reached the city. Ian had to point out the Tower of London to Barbara. Tower Bridge had lost its stone cladding, the gaunt cast iron bones twisted and strange, while William the Conqueror's great castle had been levelled. The broken-down stones were black. Wooden boards and other rubbish bridged the gaps, making homes no bigger than kitchen cupboards. It took a moment to pick out the wraith-like figures that stalked this shanty town. Their rags and skin blended in too well, as if they'd almost melted away. Ian and Bamford kept their party moving. Cannon Street brought them eventually to the great eastern end of St. Paul's Cathedral. Getting nearer, they could hear hymns being sung inside. Ian made to lead them left, taking the road round to the front of the building and on towards Holborn. Bamford, however, held back. "What is it?" said Ian, ready for danger. I want to go this way," said Bamford, jabbing her thumb to the right. She was still hoarse from the brawl. The others had caught up by now. "That's not the way to Whitehall," said Barbara. "I know," said Bamford quietly. The doctor stroked the line of his jaw. "I think perhaps you have someone you want to go calling on, Bamford stared him down. "Yes," she said. This was no time for frivolous day trips, thought Ian. They had to stay together. "Doctor," he said, "we should—" "I'll go on my own," said Bamford. "You can't stop me." "Exactly," said the doctor. "We can't stop you." He stared hard at Ian. "You'd not be so ungallant as to let her go unescorted, alone in a city like this? Where are your manners, schoolteacher?" "I don't need a minder," Bamford said resentfully. "I can take care of myself." In her bullish tone, thought Ian, there was a lot of the old general from 30 years' time. "I dare say you can," said the doctor. He said it so kindly that Ian could see Bamford relax. "I would be happier, though, if you weren't unaccompanied." Of course, thought Ian. The old devil knew she could do her own thing. He just didn't want her out of his sight, though. She was valuable, and he didn't want to lose her. "I'll go with her," said Ian, "if that's what you want." "You don't have to," began Bamford. "Thank you, my boy," said the doctor, patting him on the arm. His eyes twinkled. "I appreciate it, for my peace of mind." "I'll go with them too," said Barbara. Ian grinned at her, but she didn't smile back. She seemed cross with him, had again put up a barrier between them. He wondered if she found the young, handsome Bamford a threat. "Then it's settled," said the doctor, before anyone else could argue. "Let us meet back here at—" He looked all round him, as if for inspiration. "Midnight?" suggested Griffiths. "Will that give you enough time?" the doctor asked Bamford. "Yes," she said. "Agreed." Without another word, she headed off. "Keep with her," the doctor said. "She's important." "Yes, doctor," said Ian. "You be careful too." Without another word, the doctor, Susan, and Griffiths headed off in the other direction. Again, Susan cuddled up to the doctor. "I hope Susan is okay," Ian said to Barbara, as they hurried to catch up with Bamford. He didn't like them being just a group of 3. As a 6, they'd outnumbered most of the gangs they'd encountered so far. 3 was less of a problem for anyone wishing them ill, especially when one was an exhausted old man and another a terrified girl. "She's stronger than she looks," Barbara replied. "And the doctor knows what he's doing." Ian could only hope so. They walked on. Ian was surprised how much of the city had changed since his own time. Cheapside was like another world, the shops all gone, the road covered in broken glass and rubbish. It looked worse than he remembered during the war, the one from his youth. They carried on, passing the ruin of a church bombed in Ian's time, and then a statue of a Victorian gentleman. Rowland Hill, Barbara explained, inventor of the penny post. He seemed so terribly out of place. As they turned left into the alley called Little Britain, a gaunt woman wandered into them. Ian tried to step around her, but the woman took his arm. Her eyes were wide and vacant. "I'm sorry," said Ian, relieving her grip a finger at a time. She said nothing, just stared as if trying to focus on him. Bamford came to his rescue, holding the woman's shoulders while he extracted himself. "Is there anywhere you want to be?" she asked kindly. The woman just stared back. Then, without reason, she shook herself free from Bamford's hands and carried on down the street. "We should do something for her," said Bamford. "We can't just let her go." Ian realised his mouth was hanging open in surprise. "What?" she said. "You're worried about these people," he said. It's just not what we're used to." "The machine robbed them of their minds," Bamford bristled. "It's not their fault." He had to remember that she wasn't the vicious old woman they had known before. She hadn't become like that yet. This Bamford was a caring, decent person. What had happened to change her? "Come on," she said gruffly. "We're nearly at the hospital anyway." "It's strange seeing Nelson's column still standing," said Griffiths. "I've only ever seen it in photographs." They still had a South African embassy too. Otherwise, he thought, Trafalgar Square was the same derelict patch of concrete he remembered from the future. There were some pigeons, too dim-witted to understand that the tourists were never coming back, but there were no people. Continuing on to Whitehall, the streets seemed eerily quiet. They had had to negotiate bustling, shabby people as they'd made their way through the city, but there were no guards or gates to suggest they'd wandered into anywhere off-limits now. The light was fading, and everything seemed more shadowy, more dangerous around them. It had to be getting on for 6 in the evening? Perhaps, thought Griffiths, people went indoors at dusk. Perhaps the night simply wasn't safe. Now he was aware of it. He could see small groups of people keeping to the shadows. All had bodyguards who carried weapons, though in some cases that meant just sticks. Griffiths thought it best not to point that out to his charges. The doctor busied himself, counting off the numbers on the grand government buildings all along Whitehall. "This appears to be it," he said, outside a smog-blackened edifice no different from its neighbours. He stepped forward and tried the door. It didn't budge. "Not very friendly," he muttered, as if it were disgraceful that he could not just stroll inside. He rang the bell chain. A few moments later, a panel in the door opened, and a snooty-looking woman peered out at them. "What do you want?" "Good afternoon," said the doctor warmly. "We're here to see your most senior scientists." "Are you indeed?" said the woman sniffily. "I don't recall any appointment." "We don't have an appointment," said the doctor, "but they will want to see us, believe me." The woman's nostrils flared. She looked the three of them up and down. They must look a likely trio, thought Griffiths. He had torn his clothes in the pub brawl, and all three were exhausted from the walk. "Who exactly are you here to see?" "Your most senior scientists," repeated the doctor. He said it so convincingly, Griffiths almost hoped that she'd let them in. "You can't even give me a name?" "No, but I'm sure you know who the senior ones are. Tell them we've something to show them." "You've something to sell, is that it?" "Not at all, my dear lady. I can see you're wary, and that's very astute of you. My colleagues and I could of course be anyone. So perhaps a token of our good faith. Mr. Griffiths, you've something quite appropriate in your left pocket." It was news to Griffiths. He put his hand tentatively into the pocket, expecting to find some weapon or maybe a security card, something the doctor had slipped him. But no, he withdrew the small rounded form of his wireless telephone. "What's that?" asked the snooty woman. "Ask your best minds that question," said the doctor, handing it to her through the slot in the door. "If they don't want to talk to us, then we'll trouble you no more." The panel slammed shut. They stood on the doorstep and waited. Griffiths wondered if handing the thing over had been their best move, but thought better of saying so. Instead, he pulled faces at Susan, trying to break through that persistent sad frown. He thought he might just have seen the corners of her mouth twitch when the front door swept open. The doctor, who had been leaning on it, almost toppled into the men standing there. They were both out of breath, as if they'd just run all the way from the top floor. Neither looked the sort to take any regular exercise. Both men were pasty-skinned and overweight. And one of them, Griffiths realised, was Professor Kelly. The wispy excuse for a moustache suggested he was barely out of his teens. "Is this yours?" panted the other, senior man, holding up the phone. "That's right," said the doctor. "We fancied it would be of some interest." The two men glanced at each other. "Please, come in off the street," said the older man, waving his hand. "We've so much to talk about." "Miss Bamford?" "Yes." They hurried up to the reception booth eagerly. The hours had crept slowly by since they'd arrived, the waiting room peopled by eerie, blank-eyed zombies, like the one they'd met outside. Bamford, when Barbara had asked, said these were victims of the machine. No cure had ever been found for them, even in the future Bamford came from. It was a relief to finally get some news. Barbara felt a pang of guilt at that thought. Of course, they were also eager for Bamford's sake too. "I'm sorry, we've checked everywhere," said the receptionist, though she sounded like she wasn't sorry at all. She had more important things to be doing. "No one of that name working here." The glass partitions slid smartly shut, and the woman got on with her work. "I don't understand," said Bamford, after a moment. It was still painful for her to talk, and her words came out as barely a whisper. "She has to be here." "Perhaps there's a mistake," Barbara suggested. "You're sure that's her given name?" "Baldwin, yes." "You're asking about Karen?" They all spun round at the question. The nurse who had spoken was bustling through reception, driving an empty wheelchair in front of her. She had that practical, slightly haughty air about her that Barbara felt was so typically NHS. "You knew her?" "Yes," said Bamford. "I'm her—" "We're family," Ian cut in. "Oh, I'm sorry," said the nurse. She glanced down at the empty seat of the wheelchair, as if expecting to find some answer there. When she looked up again, she eyed them carefully. "You haven't heard," she said quietly. "Look, maybe we can find somewhere quiet." "What? What happened?" Bamford's sore throat made her sound more desperate than she probably was. "We don't have to do this here," said the nurse. "Come with me." With Ian taking Bamford by the arm, they followed the nurse into a side room, decorated in soothing, innocuous murals. There were dull grey seats all around the room, and they sat down opposite the nurse. "Look," she said, "we really did try to reach the family. I thought everyone had been told." "Just tell me," said Bamford. The nurse sat up straight, in a mannered, unreal kind of pose. She probably had to do this all the time, thought Barbara. "Karen was with an ambulance detail. They got called out to the Isle of Dogs one night, but we think it was some kind of set-up. There's this wretched colony of tramps out there, and they tore the ambulance apart. They must have thought it had food in it." "Why would an ambulance contain food?" asked Barbara. Ian glared at her. "We don't know. They're a horrible, desperate lot out there. Anyway, the crew didn't stand half a chance against them. She can't be dead, said Bamford. I'm afraid so, said the nurse, reaching out to pat Bamford's hand. I'm sorry. They all died. She bit her lip. I think it was probably quick. Of course it wasn't quick, snapped Bamford, shaking the nurse off. Where's her body? Where's she buried? I don't know, said the nurse. I guess someone came for her. I'll find out. She couldn't leave the room quickly enough. Bamford stared at the floor, while Barbara and Ian watched each other. Ian shrugged, which was no help at all. Barbara gingerly reached her arm over Bamford's shoulders to comfort her. She didn't meet my dad until 75, said Bamford, her voice uneven and strange and bereft. And she didn't die until 81. It's going to be all right, said Barbara. It was the only thing she could think of to say. No, it won't be, said Bamford, almost smiling. You see, if she's dead now, I can't ever be born. We've a team of 14 permanent staff, said Townsend, the professor in charge of the labs. He was tall, with an untended beard, and a way of shaking his head that was just like Kelly, the older Kelly, from the future. Yet he still hadn't asked their names, which Griffiths found amazing for a man with so many questions. Now, you were saying about radio frequencies. He led them through an office teeming with paper. Box files tumbled from shelves as Townsend pushed past them, documents spilling all over the floor in his wake. There were no administrative staff Griffiths could see, unless they were lost under the papers. Susan helped the doctor to step over the obstacles. Such mess would never have been allowed under Bamford's regime. Yes, said the doctor, revelling in keeping the man on tenterhooks. All in good time. You said you'd show us the artifacts first. A pooling of resources, said Townsend, nodding. We'd be only too happy to share what we've got, but frequency must determine the scale of the relays. The cells run at something between 800 and 1800 megahertz, said Griffiths, just to put the poor man out of his misery. It stopped Townsend dead in his tracks. He held a finger up to his forehead as he worked through the possible implications of that detail. It was exactly the same gesture Kelly used to do. You'd want to keep people away from the antennae, he said at last. They're too dangerous to be used too widely. Radio frequency is non-ionizing, said Griffiths. Wireless phones don't cause cancer. Poof, said Townsend, and carried on towards the vault. It was as if that was all the argument he needed to disprove Griffiths's assertion. Griffiths felt his jaw drop. It wasn't possible that such a petulant, childish man could be in charge of the whole operation here. The doctor must have seen his expression and leant forward to whisper to him. You can tell the machine took their best minds first. This idiot must be all they have left. That was it, thought Griffiths, as they continued to the vault. The man had no one to challenge him, to challenge his assumptions. It was the worst thing you could do to a scientist. It made you lazy. At the back of the room of strewn paper, their passage was blocked by an old wooden door. A no entry sign hung slightly at an angle. Townsend produced a thick bunch of keys, trying each in turn before finding the correct one. The door had a simple pin-tumbler lock. Griffiths could have picked it in less time than Townsend took to open it. The door opened in on what might have once been a broom closet, a small utility space. Townsend tugged on a hanging piece of string, and a naked light bulb blinked on. "Mean anything to you, then?" he asked. Stacked up to the ceiling were fragments of strange machinery. Griffiths cast an eye over the wrecked pieces, putting them together in his head. Something that looked like the horoscope, but more compact, drooled fibre-optic cables over what might have been an anchoring unit. It was all clearly the basis for the experiments he had worked on himself. Had it really taken them 30 years to make sense of it all? "It's a transmaterialization booth," said Susan. It was the first time Griffiths had heard her speak for a day. "Very likely," said the doctor. He turned to Townsend. Where did you happen across it? Townsend beamed with pride. Cellar of a school in East London. Army picked it up, couple of years before the machine and all that. We've not got a lot of records for back then, of course. Not much I can tell you. Good, though, isn't it? Yes, said the doctor warily. He reached a hand out and withdrew a gold-coloured pipe, leant against the stacked pieces. The pipe was a half-metre in length, and the old man and Susan both flinched on seeing it had a trumpet-like end. We call that the sink plunger, laughed Townsend. No idea what it's used for. What can have happened? Asked Susan, keeping well away from the strange machinery. I don't know, Susan, said the doctor. They must have visited the earth at some time. I don't understand, said Griffiths, not missing the doctor's grave tone. Who's they? He didn't get an answer. Grandfather, said Susan, this is what they based the experiments on. Yes, Susan, they adapted a side effect of the anchoring system. You understand it? Townsend nearly leapt for joy. The man was a liability. But if that's the case, said Susan, her eyes wide, then wherever can the TARDIS have gone?